Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I find it amusing and in other ways distressing that, first of all, people are willing to speak of their own personal idol with so little shame. When you talk to people and they use this phrase, this name for their idol, it just breaks my heart. They speak of what they call God to me. God to me is this, or God to me is that. It's a bad enough thing to fall into the false worship of an idol. It's another thing altogether to confess from the beginning your own acknowledgement that what it is you claim to be worshiping is actually your own creation. That this God didn't create you, you created it. That, to me, is the most damaging thing about God to me. But the other thing that I notice, interestingly, is that while while those who worship God to me each have their own God to them, nevertheless, it strikes me that almost all of these God to me's are precisely the same. They're very much like unto each other. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, have you ever heard anybody say, well, God to me is a consuming fire. God to me is a jealous God filled with wrath. No, we never hear that. What we always hear instead is that God to me is gentle. God to me is kind. And what we mean by gentle and kind is that, well, what do you know? God to me wants me to do what I want to do. Unfortunately, sadly, some of this thinking even infiltrates the church. If you've been following us as we've been going through our series on the sin stones, and we talked about how the second commandment includes in it not just not making idols, but the propensity that we all have to remake God in our own image. It was Mark Twain who said, God made man in his image, and ever since man has been returning the favor. Well, all of this to tell you that God is who he is. For this proper theology segment, we are remembering God's wrath. Whether we like to admit it or not, it is there. And in fact, we should like to admit it. It's never a good thing. It is a sign of what ails us that there would ever be anything about God that we were anything other than enamored with and awed by. God's wrath, friends, is not something that he's ashamed of. You know, I'm reminded, well, I should put it this way. In fact, it's something that we should praise because it is his wrath that cleanses us. And it is his wrath that protects us, that keeps us safe. Now, it wasn't long ago that I recorded a segment just from yesterday's podcast in which we talked about Jesus as our king and him subduing us to himself. Well, this is the same point here. It is his wrath by which he demonstrates his love for us. Going back once again to the principle of God's simplicity. I think it's revealed for us in Isaiah 45, which is one of those texts that just so clearly demonstrates God's absolute sovereignty over all things, including hardship. This is a message that God sends through the prophet Isaiah to Cyrus the king, in which he tells Cyrus, you thought it was all about you, but I'm the one who held you in my hand. I'm the one who took care of you. I'm the one who went before you. I'm the one who protected you. And you might think, well, isn't that sweet? Isn't that kind? Here's God expressing his love and his tenderness. But if you look closely, it points out what should be obvious to us all, that when God went before Cyrus, he went before Cyrus when Cyrus was conquering other people. This is not, I kept you safe when the boogeyman was scaring you. This is, I went before you and we tore down the gates of those cities that you conquered. I bring calamity, he says. And again, there's no shyness, there's no sorrow, there's no, I wish this wasn't like me, but now I have to admit the truth. This is God boasting about who he is and boasting about what he is, and we are to praise him. Read through your Psalms, not just the imprecatory Psalms looking forward, where God's people are asking God to pour out his wrath on God's enemies, but also when they're celebrating the history of God pouring out his wrath on his enemies. Oh, Lord, we remembered what you did to Oreb and Zeb. We remember what you did to Og, king of Zion. Lord, we know what you're like. It's a glorious thing. The God we serve is a God of wrath. He's not a God that we make up. He's not a God that we create. He is the God who is a consuming fire, whose wrath is a glorious wrath, a loving wrath, an eternal wrath. I've often speculated, friends, that it's possible that one of the reasons, recognizing, of course, some things that we might glean from Dives and Lazarus, but in the Old Covenant, there's a sense in which the afterworld is one place, not two. We talk about heaven and hell, and I believe in heaven and hell. I believe they're both real, but I also believe in some sense they're the same place. That what we experience in heaven is the loving, tender, joyful grace of God, his face shining on us. And what the sinner in hell experiences is not so much the absence of God, but the presence of God in his wrath. We're seeing the same being. And we, by his grace, are able to rejoice in it, and they, outside his grace, are horrified by it. This, friends, is the God we worship. This is the God the Bible proclaims. This is the living God. I don't think anyone would have any objection or find it strange at all that when the living God should give and proclaim law to his own people, that he would, first of all, forbid them from worshiping other gods. That he would, second of all, firmly and clearly require that he be worshipped in the way that he wishes to be worshipped. I can't imagine anyone having any kind of objection to the concept that the people of God should treat the name of God honorably and respectfully, that they should treat it as holy. But as we continue in our series, The Sin Stones, we come now to the Fourth Commandment, which actually has been an occasion not only for controversy and scandal in our day, but even for controversy and scandal in the days of Jesus. We're going to spend a couple of segments on this, but first I want to read all the way through it and then take our attention to some parts that are early on. Verse 8 of chapter 20 of the book of Exodus says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or your sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." I have argued in the past, and will probably continue to argue for many, many more years, God willing, that it's important to understand the context in which God gives his law, not that we might escape from it, but that we might understand it properly. I'll give you an example. We live in a world that for the first time in human history, we have governments all over the place recognizing as marriages, I don't even want to say relationships, but recognizing as marriages, 2 men and 2 women. One of the key beliefs that Christians have about the institution of marriage is that it's an institution by which God has blessed all men everywhere. That marriage is what we would call a creation ordinance. That is, this is a part of the law that God, in essence, spoke to all men everywhere. Not just Christians, not just Jews, not just Bible believers, all men everywhere. The same thing would be true about the principle of capital punishment as it's given to Moses, representing all people coming off the ark. And God says to Moses, if a man sheds a man's blood, by man's blood shall he be shed. By man shall his blood be shed. This is creation law. Then there are specific laws that God gives to his people Israel when he establishes them as his nation, and that's where we are with these 10 commandments. Well, what's interesting with this particular commandment is, on the one hand, it makes sense to us naturally that this would be something God would give to his people, that would set them apart from the rest of the world, that would recognize his grace to them. But this is not something that is appealed to on the basis of them being God's people. This is something that goes back to, the connection is made to God's creation order. Which, by the way, historically is one of the reasons why Christians were reasonably comfortable imposing on others what are called blue laws. Some of you are too young to remember blue laws. But when I was a boy growing up, on Sundays, there were very few businesses open. Some simply because they chose not to be, because there wasn't going to be enough market probably. Others because it was not legal for them to be open. In the state of Pennsylvania, they had some of the most rigorous blue laws and the most long-lasting blue laws. That is, it took the longest time for them to sort of fall away. When I was a kid growing up, there were 4 drugstores in the closest town, and they would take turns once each month. One of them would be open for people to be able to get their prescriptions, and the next week a different one, the next week a different one. They would rotate this so that they didn't all have to be open at the same time. Well, again, blue laws are grounded in the principle that this is creation law. And just as we decided, it doesn't really matter, this is a pluralistic culture, this is America, freedom of religion, First Amendment, it suddenly seemed odd to us that we would want to impose this on unbelievers. The same way that we changed on marriage, though we shouldn't have. Now, I'm not going to take a side as we exposit this particular commandment on some of the issues that divide Christians about it. But the one thing I also wanted to mention, besides this sort of very interesting reality that while this seems more like a ceremonial law given to God's people, it is connected to the created order. I also want to point out something that we often miss. There is a positive commandment here. We're called to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Then verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Now, friends, I don't have a quarrel with people enjoying a weekend. I don't have a quarrel with them enjoying a long weekend. But I do find it interesting that one of the reasons we find it so difficult to rest on the Lord's day is because we're busy recreating on Saturday. That is, we don't make the time to do the work that needs to be done in the 6 days that He's given us to do the work. Because we're too busy not working on the 6th day. I get that. I felt that. I love watching football on Sundays. That might offend some. I could get into college football and watch it on Saturdays, but I've got things to do. Now, it may not be the job that I'm paid to do. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's doing the job that I'd like to be paid to do that I'm not paid to do. But other times it might be yard work or errands or things of that nature. But I am supposed to be busy. And when you do that, you know what you'll find? It's an amazing thing. You'll find you're very tired on the Lord's day, and you'll want to rest. Well, as we come back to this command in the next segment, we're going to look at what rest looks like. We're going to maybe highlight some of the different perspectives that people have on what our responsibilities are. And whether we'll have one or two more on this one, I'm not sure. I'm going to have to guess we're going to have two more because I have a lot more to say. But for now, I've got more work to do. The summer before I was to start my freshman year at Grove City College, I persuaded my parents to allow me to go and attend a conference on the campus of Grove City. It was a 2-hour drive from home. That was the longest drive I'd ever taken at that point by myself. And I attended this conference with various and sundry speakers, communicating and defending free market economics, which was just right up my bailiwick and the principal reason that I chose Grove City College. And I had my professor, Dr. Hans Senholz, a student of Ludwig von Mises's, speak at this event. But there was another fella, a good-looking fella, by the name of John Van Til, who also spoke. And I had not heard of John or met John before, but I met him there. Well, a few months later, there I was, a freshman at Grove City, and I was operating under the mistaken assumption that not only was the administration, not only was the economics department, but all of the faculty and all of the students were going to be as zealous for free markets as I was. I had a class. My first class was with Dr. Andy Hoffecker, someone I've covered earlier, very early on in our Heroes You Never Heard Of series, in which he talked about philosophy and theology, and it was all right up my alley, and it was just what I expected. But then I had one of these classes that I had to take called The Creative Dimension of Life. It was a year-long course that was sort of a combination of freshman English and humanities. And my professor was not someone I'd ever heard of. She was instead the wife of John Van Til, who I'd heard at that conference. I didn't know what to expect. I just sat down. It was a big class, 60 people probably. And there was this woman, this dignified woman, but friendly, smiling woman who just opened up before me a whole world that I knew nothing about. It wasn't so much the writing part, it was the humanities part. I learned about Doric and Ionic columns. I learned about, I remember reading about the Black Plague in her class, all sorts of things that were new to me, art things that I didn't understand. And she was this introduction to me, this gateway to me, and she was so very wise. But even though she was the wife of this fellow who spoke at this conference, she upset me one day in class. She started talking about consumerism and how consumerism was a bad thing. Well, I was a young man, and I was still relatively new to loving free market economics. And because of that, I took her warnings about consumerism as an attack on the marketplace. And I got mad. And I pushed back. Now, I did so respectfully because I was already just taken by this dignified, wonderful professor. But I did push back, and it took me many years. It took me probably 15 years before I looked back on that lecture and thought, boy, she was right. And it's not an argument against free markets at all. It's really a question about our hearts. And consumerism is a real thing, a dangerous thing, where we find our meaning in the things that we have and in displaying our wealth. And I wrote to her. Actually, I wrote about her. We did an issue of Table Talk magazine when I was the editor on consumerism, and I told this story that I just told you. And I sent her a copy and said, Mrs. Van Til, I just wanted you to know. It eventually got through to me. It took a long time. And I am so grateful to you for your patience with me. And Mrs. Van Til wrote back a very gracious and sweet letter. And we had a couple more back and forths. And we lost touch. Well, a few days ago, I got a message through social media from someone I'd met once but didn't really know well at all. And they said to me, hey, there's no nice, easy way to say this, but Mrs. Van Til's passed away. These folks who didn't know me very well remembered me talking about her. And they talked about what a wonderful, godly woman she had been in their lives. She went on to her reward. And she is in the presence of Jesus. Her husband, John, he's still with us, but it probably won't be long until he joins her. Now, friends, all these segments that we have done on heroes you've never heard of, I've always concluded with an exhortation to you to please follow this example. Think through, and you know what? If you can't think of anybody, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to give you some tough love here. If you can't think of anybody in your past that you could speak an encouraging word to who meant something to you, then the problem isn't with your past. The problem is with your present, with you. This doesn't have to be the greatest rock star ever. This doesn't have to be someone without any flaws or any weaknesses. Remember the people who invested in you. Track them down. Use Google. Google is your friend. And send them a message. I'm so glad that I was so glad when I heard that Mrs. Van Til had passed away. Not that she had passed away, but was so glad that I didn't wait until it was too late. That I had that opportunity not only to speak well of her personally and privately, but that I was able to speak well to her, to the whole readership of Table Talk magazine back in the day. Friends, I want to encourage all of us to encourage all of us. There's something profoundly healthy. There's something profoundly biblical to speak words of edification, to encourage and lift one another up, and to speak life into our brothers and sisters, and in the case of Mrs. Van Til, our mothers and grandmothers. She was a remarkable, remarkable woman. And you know what's something? She's even more remarkable now. So friends, get to work. Send a message. And let your heroes know that they were heroes. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.